Under a gray morning sky, the tide rolled in heavy and cold. It was June 6, 1944, along the coast of Normandy, France. Allied forces prepared to land on 5 beaches codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. This day marked the start of Operation Overlord, the largest seaborne invasion in history. Thousands of ships stretched across the horizon. The soldiers aboard knew they would face fierce German defenses, but the mission was clear: break through Hitler's Atlantic Wall and open a path into occupied Europe. The assault began with a massive naval bombardment. Allied battleships and cruisers fired at German fortifications built into the cliffs and dunes. The goal was to weaken enemy positions before the troops went ashore. At the same time, bombers crossed the coastline, dropping tons of explosives on bunkers, bridges, and roads. Many bombs missed their targets due to heavy cloud cover and strong winds. As a result, much of the German defensive network remained intact when the first landing craft approached the beaches. The technical planning for this operation had taken months. Engineers had studied the tides, currents, and beach gradients to determine when and where troops could land. The Higgins boat, a flat-bottomed landing craft designed in the United States, played a critical role. Each vessel could carry 36 men and a small amount of equipment. The front ramp dropped quickly, allowing soldiers to charge directly onto the sand. Specialized tanks known as DD tanks, short for duplex drive, were outfitted with flotation screens and propellers. They were supposed to swim ashore and provide cover fire, but many sank in the rough surf before reaching land. Engineers also brought along bulldozers and demolition teams to clear obstacles like wooden stakes, metal tripods, and mines set by the Germans. On Omaha Beach, the situation quickly turned grim. Strong currents pushed landing craft off course. German machine guns, hidden in concrete bunkers, opened fire as soon as the ramps dropped. Mortars and artillery shells rained down. Many men were killed before they even reached the waterline. Radio communication broke down amid the chaos. Officers tried to rally their troops, but units became scattered and mixed. Some soldiers took cover behind small sand dunes, while others crawled forward inch by inch. Medics worked under constant fire to treat the wounded. Ammunition and equipment were lost to the rising tide. At Utah Beach, things went more smoothly. A strong current carried the first wave of troops nearly 2,000 yards south of their intended landing zone. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the first senior officer ashore, assessed the situation and made a quick decision. He ordered the men to start the war from here, rather than waste time moving back to the original target. His leadership helped secure the beachhead with fewer casualties than expected. In the air, paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions dropped behind enemy lines hours before the amphibious landings. Their mission was to seize key bridges and roadways to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Poor visibility scattered many of the paratroopers across the countryside. Some landed in flooded fields and drowned under the weight of their gear. Others gathered in small groups and attacked German positions on their own initiative. These scattered units caused confusion among the defenders and disrupted enemy communications. German forces were caught off guard by the scale of the attack, but they responded with determination. The Atlantic Wall was manned by experienced troops as well as conscripts from occupied countries. Many positions were heavily fortified with concrete bunkers, barbed wire, and artillery. At Omaha Beach, the 352nd Infantry Division mounted a fierce defense. Commanders struggled to bring reinforcements forward due to Allied air attacks on roads and bridges. German high command hesitated to release armored divisions without direct orders from Hitler, who slept through much of the initial invasion and could not be reached immediately. As the day wore on, tactical decisions shaped the battle's outcome. On Omaha, small groups of soldiers managed to find weak points in the German defenses. Engineers blew gaps in the obstacles with explosives, allowing more troops and vehicles to move inland. Naval destroyers risked running aground to fire directly at enemy positions at close range. At Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches, British and Canadian forces advanced steadily despite resistance. Tanks and infantry worked together to push past villages and fortified strongpoints. The human experience of this day was marked by fear, courage, and loss. Soldiers recalled the deafening noise of gunfire, explosions, and shouting. Many remembered the smell of salt water mixed with smoke and blood. Letters found later described men praying in silence as they waited for the ramps to drop. Civilians in nearby towns huddled in basements as shells struck their homes. Some emerged to help the wounded once the fighting passed. Medics improvised stretchers from doors and farm carts. Chaplains moved among the dying, offering comfort where they could. By nightfall, the Allies held tenuous positions along the coast. Casualties were high, especially at Omaha, but the beachheads were secure. Supplies and reinforcements began to pour ashore. Engineers built temporary harbors known as mulberries to handle the massive flow of men and equipment. In the following days, the Allies linked the separate landing zones into a continuous front. German counterattacks failed to dislodge them. The foothold in Normandy gave the Allies a base to launch further offensives into France and beyond. The invasion's success relied on planning, technology, and individual acts of bravery. It marked the beginning of the end for Nazi control in Western Europe. The events of that day showed the complexity of modern warfare, where strategy, equipment, and human will all intertwined on a vast and deadly stage. The invasion of Normandy was not only a test of courage but also a test of planning and engineering. Months of preparation went into making sure the assault could succeed. The English Channel was a natural barrier that had to be crossed. The tides, currents, and weather were studied in detail. Naval officers and engineers examined charts and photographs taken by reconnaissance planes. French resistance fighters sent reports about German defenses, roads, and troop movements. Every detail mattered because the success of the landing depended on timing and precision. The invasion fleet was unlike anything seen before. It included over 5,000 ships of different types. There were battleships and cruisers that provided heavy gunfire, destroyers that screened against enemy submarines, and troop transports that carried soldiers across the channel. The landing craft, especially the Higgins boat, was the heart of the operation. These flat-bottomed boats could run up onto the beach, drop their front ramp, and allow men and small vehicles to rush ashore. They were made of wood and steel, simple but reliable. Each one carried about 36 soldiers. The design allowed rapid unloading under fire, which was critical since lingering in the surf meant certain death from German guns. Special vehicles were created for the invasion. Some tanks were fitted with flotation devices that allowed them to swim through the water. These were called duplex drive or DD tanks. They had canvas screens that rose up around the hull and propellers that pushed them forward. In theory, they would land with the first wave of infantry and provide cover. In practice, many sank in rough seas before they reached land, especially at Omaha Beach. Engineers also modified other tanks to carry flamethrowers or heavy mortars to deal with bunkers. Some tanks were equipped with flails that beat the ground to detonate mines safely before troops advanced. The beaches were covered with obstacles built by German engineers under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Wooden stakes with mines attached were placed at different tide levels. Steel tripods known as hedgehogs were positioned to stop landing craft. Concrete walls and anti-tank ditches were dug behind the beaches. The defenses were part of the Atlantic Wall, a vast network of fortifications stretching from Norway to the French-Spanish border. Bunkers with thick concrete walls housed machine guns and artillery pieces. These positions were interconnected with trenches and tunnels, allowing defenders to move and counterattack. Weather played a critical role in the invasion. Strong winds and rough seas made navigation difficult. Heavy cloud cover reduced the accuracy of Allied bombers. The original date for the assault was June 5th, but it was delayed by a day due to poor conditions. Even on June 6th, the weather remained marginal. Some landing craft were pushed off course by the currents. Paratroopers dropped inland were scattered across miles of countryside. Despite these challenges, the decision to go ahead proved correct because the Germans did not expect an attack in such conditions. The terrain of Normandy added to the complexity. The beaches varied in shape and size. Some were wide and open, while others were narrow with steep cliffs. Inland, the countryside was divided by hedgerows, thick earth and vegetation barriers that made movement difficult and gave defenders cover. At Omaha Beach, the ground rose sharply, giving German forces a commanding view of the shoreline. This high ground was fortified with positions that could fire directly down on the landing troops. Engineers had to find ways to breach these defenses under constant fire, using explosives and specialized vehicles. The assault involved multiple divisions from different Allied nations. American forces landed at Utah and Omaha beaches. The U.S. 4th Infantry Division led the attack at Utah, while the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions bore the brunt of the fighting at Omaha. British forces landed at Gold and Sword beaches. Canadian forces took Juno Beach. Each division had its own objectives and zones of advance. Airborne divisions were dropped behind enemy lines hours before the main landing. The U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions secured bridges and crossroads near Utah Beach. The British 6th Airborne Division captured key positions near Sword Beach, including bridges over the Orne River. The coordination of land, sea, and air forces was vital. Naval gunfire had to be timed to lift just as troops went ashore, preventing friendly fire while still suppressing enemy defenses. Aircraft dropped paratroopers and bombed coastal defenses, though the bombing often fell short due to poor visibility. Signals units worked to maintain communication among ships, ground forces, and headquarters in England. Supply ships followed the first wave, carrying ammunition, fuel, and medical equipment. Engineers built temporary harbors, called mulberries, which allowed cargo ships to unload even without a permanent port. These harbors were constructed from massive floating sections that were towed across the channel and assembled offshore. Logistics were as critical as combat. A steady flow of supplies was needed to sustain the invasion. Fuel for vehicles, food for the troops, spare parts for equipment, and medical care for the wounded all had to be planned. Engineers prepared to lay down prefabricated roadways on the beaches so trucks could move inland without bogging down in the sand. Bulldozers cleared wreckage and obstacles as soon as areas were secured. Without this constant support, the initial success would have stalled. The Germans relied on their own network of logistics, but Allied bombing campaigns had already damaged many rail lines and bridges in northern France. This slowed the movement of German reserves to the front. Rommel had ordered defenses strengthened along the beaches, but he faced shortages of concrete, steel, and manpower. Some divisions defending the coast were under strength and included conscripts from other countries. Elite armored units were held back inland as a mobile reserve, but delays in decision-making prevented them from reaching the beaches in time to repel the assault. The clash of technology and planning came to a head on the morning of June 6. For the Allies, the combination of specialized landing craft, naval gunfire, air support, and trained divisions was essential. For the Germans, the natural terrain and fortified positions offered a strong defense. The outcome depended on which side could adapt faster to the unfolding chaos. Every detail, from the height of the tide to the placement of a single machine gun, affected the lives of the men on those beaches. The first light of dawn revealed the armada spread across the horizon. From the shore, German sentries stared in disbelief as hundreds of ships loomed out of the mist. The sound of engines and the deep rumble of naval guns broke the morning calm. Within moments, the coastal batteries opened fire, their shells whistling over the water. Allied destroyers and cruisers answered with a barrage of their own, shaking the earth as explosions tore through the German fortifications. The landing craft moved forward through rough seas. Soldiers crouched inside, gripping rifles and packs, their faces pale and wet from spray. Orders were shouted over the roar of engines. At Omaha Beach, the approach was chaotic. Strong currents pushed many boats off course. Some hit submerged obstacles and sank. Men tumbled into the cold water, weighed down by heavy gear. Those who reached shallow water waded toward the shore under constant fire. German machine guns raked the surf, cutting down soldiers before they reached cover. Mortars exploded among the landing craft, splintering wood and steel. The carefully planned formations dissolved within minutes. At Utah Beach, the first wave landed almost 2,000 yards south of their intended target. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr. came ashore with his men and quickly assessed the situation. Instead of trying to reposition the entire force, he made a swift decision. "We'll start the war from right here," he told his officers. This quick choice prevented confusion and allowed the troops to advance inland. His leadership kept the attack moving despite the unexpected landing point. Back at Omaha, chaos threatened to overwhelm the assault. Radios were soaked and useless. Smoke and sand blinded officers trying to direct their units. Small groups of men clustered behind obstacles, pinned down by fire from the bluffs above. Leaders like Lieutenant Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment shouted for his men to move forward. "There are two kinds of people on this beach," he said. "The dead and those about to die. Now let's get moving." Slowly, soldiers crawled forward, using whatever cover they could find. Engineers carrying explosives crept toward the obstacles and began blasting gaps through barbed wire and mines. Destroyers came in dangerously close to the shore. Their guns fired directly into the German strongpoints. One ship, the USS Satterley, moved so near that its gunners could see individual enemy positions through the smoke. This close support gave the infantry a chance to advance. By late morning, small groups of soldiers reached the base of the bluffs and began climbing with ropes and ladders. German defenders fought fiercely from bunkers and trenches, but once a foothold was established, the balance began to shift. Inland, the airborne divisions faced their own challenges. Paratroopers from the 101st and 82nd Airborne had dropped hours earlier under cover of darkness. Poor visibility scattered them across the countryside. Some units landed far from their objectives. Small groups of paratroopers gathered where they could, using landmarks to orient themselves. They attacked bridges, road junctions, and communication centers to disrupt German movements. Many of these actions were improvised, driven by initiative rather than direct orders. At St. Miraglisse, paratroopers fought house to secure control of the vital crossroads. Their actions delayed German reinforcements and created confusion behind enemy lines. On Sword Beach, British troops faced heavy resistance near the town of Ouistreham. Tanks from the 79th Armored Division moved ahead to support the infantry. These specialized vehicles, nicknamed Hobart's Funnies, included tanks equipped with flamethrowers, mine flails, and bridge-laying gear. They helped clear obstacles and neutralize bunkers. Despite this support, progress was slow. German artillery from inland positions pounded the beach. British commanders adjusted by shifting units to flank the defenses rather than assaulting them head-on. At Juno Beach, Canadian forces encountered rough surf and heavily fortified positions. Many landing craft were delayed or destroyed before reaching the shore. When the troops finally landed, they faced concentrated machine gun fire. The first wave suffered heavy casualties, but follow-up waves pressed forward. By mid-morning, Canadian soldiers had broken through the initial defenses and were pushing inland toward their objectives. Their advance created pressure on German units defending the neighboring British beaches. Communication between different landing zones was limited. Commanders relied on runners, signal flags, and sporadic radio contact. This made it difficult to coordinate movements. Decisions often had to be made by officers on the ground based on incomplete information. At Omaha, the lack of clear orders forced junior officers to take initiative. Some units bypassed strongpoints entirely, moving inland to link up with paratroopers. Others focused on securing exits from the beach to allow vehicles and supplies to move forward. German commanders faced their own challenges. The scale of the invasion shocked them. Many had believed the main attack would come at Pas-de-Calais, farther north. As reports came in, confusion spread through the chain of command. Field Marshal Rommel was away visiting his family when the assault began. Without his authority, frontline commanders hesitated to release armored reserves. Hitler, who controlled the movement of these key units, slept through much of the morning and could not be reached. By the time orders were given, traffic jams and Allied air attacks delayed the German counterattack. By afternoon, the tide began to turn. At Omaha, the bluffs were secured, and engineers cleared paths through the minefields. Vehicles started to come ashore, bringing much-needed firepower. At Utah, troops linked up with paratroopers who had secured key bridges. British and Canadian forces pushed inland from their beaches, though German resistance remained strong in certain sectors. Naval guns continued to support the ground forces, pounding enemy positions that threatened the advance. The day's fighting was marked by moments of desperation and adaptation. Soldiers faced obstacles that no plan could have predicted. Leaders at every level had to make rapid choices under fire. A destroyed landing craft might become cover for advancing troops. A farmhouse might serve as a command post one moment and a defensive position the next. By nightfall, the beaches were littered with wreckage, bodies, and equipment. The Allies held a fragile foothold, but the outcome was still uncertain. The decisions made amid the smoke and chaos of that first day shaped the course of the battle to come. The men sat shoulder to shoulder in the landing craft, silent except for the sound of the engine and the waves slapping against the hull. Each soldier gripped his rifle and pack, waiting for the signal. Some stared at the floor, lost in thought. Others glanced at photographs tucked inside helmets or pockets. Private Jack Reynolds, a 20-year-old from Ohio, clutched a small letter from his sister. He had read it so many times the paper had gone soft. She had written about planting tomatoes in the garden and how their dog waited by the gate each evening. The words seemed far away now, like they belonged to another life. As the ramp dropped, noise and chaos exploded around them. Machine gun fire cracked overhead. Men shouted and fell into the surf. Reynolds hit the cold water and stumbled forward, his pack dragging him down. He cut himself free with his knife and crawled through the waves. Ahead of him, a sergeant was shouting for the men to move, but his voice was drowned out by mortar blasts. Reynolds reached a wooden obstacle and crouched behind it, gasping for breath. Around him lay bodies, their equipment floating in the tide. A medic worked frantically on a wounded man, tearing open a bandage pack with his teeth. The medic, Corporal David Kaplan, had been on the beach since the first wave. His bag was almost empty now. He ripped strips of cloth from his own uniform to use as makeshift bandages. Bullets snapped past as he pressed his hands to a soldier's chest wound, trying to slow the bleeding. When another man collapsed nearby, Kaplan crawled to him, dragging his aid kit through the sand. He worked without pause, moving from one wounded soldier to the next. Later he would remember none of their faces, only the sound of their breathing and the weight of their bodies as he pulled them to safety. Farther inland, paratroopers were scattered across fields and villages. Lieutenant Paul Carter of the 101st Airborne landed in a flooded meadow in the dark. His parachute dragged him under the water, and he kicked free just in time. Alone and disoriented, he moved toward the sound of gunfire. Along the way, he gathered a handful of men from different units. None of them knew where they were, but Carter made a decision. They would attack a nearby road junction to block German reinforcements. The fight was brief and brutal. Afterward, Carter found himself kneeling beside a young private who had been shot through the leg. The private gripped his hand and asked if he would make it home. Carter said yes, though he was not sure it was true. In the towns and farms of Normandy, civilians experienced their own terror. In the village of Vierville, Marie Lefebvre huddled in her cellar with her 2 children. All night they had listened to the distant rumble of guns. At dawn, the noise grew closer. The walls shook as shells landed nearby. Marie held her children close, whispering that it would soon be over. When the door finally opened, it was not German soldiers but Americans. The first man through the doorway was covered in sand and sweat, his helmet tilted to one side. He spoke no French, but he smiled and handed the children pieces of chocolate from his pocket. Marie began to cry, a mix of relief and fear. Outside, the village was in ruins. Smoke rose from burning buildings, and the air stank of cordite and salt. On Omaha Beach, as the tide rose, bodies and wreckage began to wash ashore. Private Reynolds found himself moving with a small group of survivors. They followed a lieutenant up a narrow path between the bluffs. Every step was a struggle. At one point, they passed a destroyed machine gun nest where the sand was blackened and littered with spent shell casings. The men avoided looking at the bodies inside. At the top of the bluff, they paused to catch their breath. Reynolds pulled out his sister's letter and read a single line before folding it back into his pocket. It reminded him why he was there, though the reasons felt both simple and impossibly far away. Near Sword Beach, British troops fought street by street in a small town. Sergeant William Harris led his squad into a house taken over by German soldiers. The air inside was thick with dust and smoke. They cleared each room methodically, rifles at the ready. In the back room, Harris found a family hiding under a table. The father raised his hands in fear until Harris motioned for them to stay quiet. Later, as they moved on, one of the younger soldiers muttered that he hadn't realized civilians were so close to the fighting. Harris said nothing. There was no time to think about it. By late afternoon, exhausted men began digging shallow foxholes on the beaches and inland fields. Engineers built makeshift shelters from wrecked landing craft. Medics organized aid stations under tarps and broken vehicles. Kaplan worked through the night, treating burns, fractures, and shrapnel wounds by the light of a single lantern. He kept moving even when his hands shook from fatigue. At one point, a chaplain joined him, offering prayers for the dying. They worked side by side, each focused on their own task. Civilians emerged cautiously from hiding places as the gunfire moved inland. Some brought buckets of water or blankets for the wounded. Others searched the ruins of their homes. Marie found her neighbor's house completely destroyed. Its roof collapsed and walls burned. She picked through the rubble in silence while her children clung to her skirt. Soldiers and civilians shared brief moments of connection amid the devastation. A Canadian private gave a young boy a tin of biscuits. An American paratrooper shared a cigarette with a French farmer before moving on. These small gestures were reminders of life beyond the battlefield. As night fell, the beaches glowed with fires from wreckage and flares. The sounds of war faded, replaced by the low murmur of voices and the distant rumble of vehicles bringing reinforcements. For the men and women who lived through that day, the memories would never fade. Each face, each sound, each fleeting moment was etched into their minds, carried with them long after the guns fell silent. As darkness settled over Normandy on June 6, 1944, the beaches were littered with wreckage and bodies. Fires burned along the shoreline. Soldiers dug in wherever they could, unsure if they would hold their ground through the night. The outcome of the day's fighting had been uncertain for hours, but by evening the Allies controlled a narrow strip of land along the coast. It was fragile, exposed, and under constant threat of counterattack, yet it marked a turning point in the war. The Western Allies had returned to mainland Europe. The immediate effect was to break through Hitler's Atlantic Wall. For years, the German command had boasted that their fortifications made invasion impossible. The landings proved otherwise. Even though Omaha Beach nearly failed, the combined assaults across 5 beaches created a breach that German forces could not seal. By holding these positions, the Allies gained ports and roads that allowed more troops, tanks, and supplies to pour in. Within days, thousands of additional soldiers crossed the channel, followed by endless streams of trucks, artillery, and fuel. The logistics effort became a constant tide moving from England to France. German forces were thrown into confusion. Many commanders had believed the main Allied attack would come at Pas de Calais, where the coastline was closest to England. To support this belief, the Allies had carried out an elaborate deception campaign called Operation Fortitude. Fake radio traffic, dummy tanks, and a fictitious army group led by General George Patton convinced the Germans to keep powerful divisions in reserve far from Normandy. Even after the landings, Hitler and his high command hesitated, thinking the Normandy assault might be a diversion. This delay cost them valuable time. Armored divisions that might have crushed the beachheads remained idle or were trapped in traffic jams caused by Allied bombing. The impact on German strategy was immediate. Rommel had warned that the key to defeating an invasion was to destroy it on the beaches before the Allies could build up their strength. By the end of June 6, that opportunity had slipped away. The Germans now faced a grinding battle of attrition. Their forces had to fight on 2 major fronts: in the east against the Soviet Union and now in the west against the British, Americans, and Canadians. Supplies and reinforcements were stretched thin. Every soldier sent to Normandy was one less defending the vast territories still held in Eastern Europe. For the Allies, the beachheads became the foundation for a massive campaign. Engineers worked around the clock to build two artificial harbors, known as mulberries, out of floating concrete sections. These harbors allowed ships to unload cargo even though no French port had yet been captured. Within weeks, fuel pipelines were laid under the channel, providing a steady flow of gasoline for tanks and trucks. Airfields were built on cleared farmland so Allied fighters and bombers could operate directly from French soil. The invasion force grew larger every day, while German units dwindled under constant attack. The fighting in Normandy shifted quickly from a beach landing to a broader campaign. The countryside was divided by hedgerows, thick walls of earth and vegetation that turned each field into a natural fortress. Progress inland was slow and costly. Allied commanders debated tactics and shifted divisions between sectors to find weak points in the German line. The capture of Cherbourg, a port city on the Cotentin Peninsula, was an early goal. Once taken, it provided a vital link for supplies and reinforcements. As more territory fell under Allied control, the network of roads and railways expanded, making it easier to support large-scale operations. Politically, the landings had a powerful effect. The governments of occupied nations saw clear proof that liberation was underway. French resistance fighters increased their attacks on German supply lines and communications, aiding the advance. In London and Washington, the success of the invasion strengthened confidence among leaders and populations weary from years of war. The Soviet Union, which had borne the brunt of fighting in the East, welcomed the opening of a true second front. This eased some of the tension between Allied powers and demonstrated a shared commitment to defeating Nazi Germany. The Germans attempted several counterattacks in the weeks following D-Day. The most significant was Operation Luttich, a concentrated strike near the town of Mortain aimed at cutting off Allied forces. It failed due to rapid Allied response and overwhelming air power. By late July, American forces launched Operation Cobra, breaking through German lines and pouring into open country. This allowed fast-moving armored divisions to encircle large portions of the German army. Thousands of enemy soldiers were captured or killed as retreating units were trapped in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. As the Allies advanced, the scale of their foothold in France grew. What had begun as a tenuous beachhead now became a launching point for liberation across Western Europe. Paris was freed in August. Belgian and Dutch cities followed in the fall. Each success weakened Germany's ability to resist. Resources were diverted from the Eastern Front to try to stem the tide in the West, but it was never enough. Allied bombing campaigns targeted factories, rail yards, and oil facilities, crippling the German war economy. The landings also forced changes in German military leadership. Rommel, gravely injured in a later air attack, was removed from command. Other senior officers argued over strategy and resources. Hitler increasingly issued orders based on ideology rather than military reality, insisting on holding territory at all costs. This rigid approach led to catastrophic losses as German units were encircled and destroyed rather than allowed to retreat and regroup. For the Allies, the success of D-Day validated years of planning and cooperation. British, American, Canadian, and other Allied forces had fought side by side under a unified command. The logistical achievements were as important as the combat victories. Supply chains stretched back across the ocean to factories in the United States and Canada. Every rifle, tank, and uniform had to be delivered, tracked, and distributed. This level of coordination demonstrated the industrial and organizational strength that would ultimately overwhelm Germany. By securing Normandy, the Allies created a permanent Western Front. This forced Germany to fight a two-front war it could not win. The pressure from east and west steadily closed in, reducing the territory under German control. Each mile gained in France brought the Allies closer to Germany's borders. The landings were not the end of the war, but they set in motion events that would lead to the collapse of the Nazi regime less than a year later. The outcome of June 6th was not just a victory on the beaches. It was the opening move in the final phase of the conflict. The beaches of Normandy are quiet now. The tide rolls in and out as it did on that June morning, but the sounds of war are gone. Small towns that were once in ruins have been rebuilt. Farmers tend fields where tanks once clashed and artillery shells tore the earth apart. Yet reminders of the invasion are everywhere. Concrete bunkers still sit on the cliffs, their walls cracked but standing. Rusted metal obstacles remain buried in the sand, exposed only when the tide is low. These relics are silent witnesses to the scale of what happened here. In the years after the war, the people of Normandy rebuilt their homes and lives. Many who lived through that day never forgot the fear and destruction. Families who hid in cellars during the bombardment later opened their doors to the soldiers who returned as visitors. Stories of courage and sacrifice passed down through generations. Children grew up knowing that their freedom had been secured by strangers who came from across the sea. Memorials began to rise along the coast, built by the nations whose soldiers fought and died there. These sites became places for reflection, where names are carved in stone and flags from many countries fly side by side. One of the most striking memorials is the American cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach. Rows of white crosses and stars of David stretch across a field of green grass. Each marker bears a name, a unit, and a date. The sound of the waves drifts up from below, a reminder of how close the battle came to failing. Visitors walk among the graves, reading the inscriptions and leaving flowers or small flags. For many, the site brings a deeper understanding of the cost of the operation. Nearby, museums display weapons, uniforms, and personal items recovered from the battlefield. Letters written by soldiers are preserved behind glass, their words telling of fear, hope, and determination. Every year on June 6th, ceremonies take place along the Normandy coast. Veterans who are able return to stand on the beaches where they once fought. They are joined by families, officials, and citizens from many nations. Speeches are given, but much of the commemoration is marked by silence. As the sun rises, wreaths are laid in the water, and military bands play solemn music. These events are not only to honor the dead, but also to remind future generations of the unity required to defeat tyranny. The commemorations have become symbols of international cooperation and shared sacrifice. The legacy of the invasion also lives in military lessons learned. D-Day showed the importance of joint operations involving land, sea, and air forces. The planning for logistics, intelligence, and deception shaped modern military doctrine. Techniques first used during the landings, such as the construction of temporary harbors and the coordinated use of paratroopers with amphibious assaults, influenced later conflicts. Military academies study the operation in detail, examining both its successes and its failures. The lessons go beyond tactics, emphasizing the need for clear communication and flexibility in the face of chaos. For France and other occupied nations, the liberation of Normandy marked the beginning of freedom after years of oppression. It also shaped post-war politics. The relationships built among allied nations during the campaign laid the foundation for future alliances like NATO. These ties were not just military but political, as countries worked together to rebuild Europe and prevent another global conflict. The invasion proved that large-scale cooperation was possible when the stakes were high enough. That sense of shared purpose influenced decisions during the Cold War and beyond. Normandy itself became a place of pilgrimage. Veterans brought their families to show them where they had fought. Schools organized trips for students to walk the beaches and visit the cemeteries. Tour guides told stories of individual soldiers, linking the vastness of the invasion to personal acts of bravery. Local residents continued to care for the memorials, seeing them as part of their heritage. Some kept photos or small artifacts found in their fields, quiet reminders of the day their villages were forever changed. Over time, as veterans passed away, their memories were preserved in books, films, and interviews. Documentaries recorded their voices, capturing the details of their experiences before they were lost. Museums expanded their collections, using digital archives to make history accessible to future generations. These efforts ensured that the story of D-Day would not fade, even as living witnesses became fewer each year. The beaches remain open to the public, not as battlefields but as places of learning and reflection. The cultural memory of D-Day extends beyond Normandy. Cities and towns around the world hold their own memorial services. Streets, schools, and parks are named after the beaches or units that took part in the landings. Works of art, literature, and film keep the narrative alive, exploring the human side of the conflict. Some focus on strategy and leadership, while others highlight the experiences of individual soldiers and civilians. Together, they form a collective understanding of the event and its meaning. In military circles, D-Day is still studied as an example of how to plan and execute a complex operation. The coordination required among different nations, branches of service, and units set a standard that continues to influence modern warfare. The technology has changed, but the principles remain relevant. The invasion showed that success comes from preparation, adaptability, and the willingness to face uncertainty. The geopolitical consequences of D-Day continue to shape the world. The liberation of Western Europe helped establish a balance of power that lasted through the second half of the 20th century. The alliances formed during the war evolved into lasting partnerships. The idea of collective defense, tested on the beaches of Normandy, became central to international relations. These connections still affect global politics today. Walking along the shoreline now, it is hard to imagine the noise and destruction of that morning. The sand is smooth, and the sea is calm. Tourists explore the remains of bunkers, and children play where soldiers once fought for every inch of ground. The quiet can feel deceptive, but it is a sign of what was achieved. The beaches that once represented invasion and sacrifice now stand for peace and remembrance. Each year, as the ceremonies take place and new generations come to learn the story, the legacy of that day continues to grow. The past remains present here, written in the landscape and in the memories carried forward by those who refuse to forget.